Joining me to discuss the fallout of the 2024 U.S. presidential elections are Christina Greer, an associate professor of political science and American studies at Fordham University, Katie Halper, journalist and host of the Katie Halper Show, Ryan Grimm, reporter and co-founder of DropSite News, and Emma Doyle, former White House Principal Deputy Chief of Staff under the Trump administration. Good to see you all. Emma, I'm going to start with you. This is a historic comeback. I mean, this race was projected to be close, but it wasn't that close. We saw a Trump tide overtake the United States. I mean, this was somewhat unforeseeable for many of us. He got more than the necessary 270 electoral votes. He's favored to win all 7 swing states, and he's set to be the first Republican to win the popular vote in more than 2 decades. Wow, why did this happen?
I think voters thought about what life was like for them under the first Trump administration. I think if you turn off the news, you're not on Twitter, you're not a inside the Beltway or perpetually online voter, you're thinking about the economy and you're thinking specifically about the cost of living. And you've seen 4 years with Kamala Harris, not in the White House, but in the administration as vice president, and 4 years of Donald Trump as president. Comparing those two, if you like the way your life felt personally under the Trump administration, you're pulling the lever for Trump again.
How do you make sense of that against the backdrop of, life under Trump being there's COVID, there's pandemics, there are levels of economic collapse under Biden. Some would argue the economy was stronger, the stock market looked stronger, things look stronger. How do people make sense of this idea that life under Trump was better, and what kind of person makes that claim?
I think that the pandemic took place sort of out of time for a lot of voters. I think 2020 and 2021, if you're to ask most voters how much of that was Donald Trump, how much of that was Joe Biden, I think it blurs together. People were living in a very strange headspace for that amount of time. So I think, I don't know that either administration really gets blame or credit for the COVID years specifically. I think people are thinking, when I think people think about Donald Trump, they're thinking about 2018, 2019, they're thinking about no new foreign wars, they're thinking about record low unemployment. That's my theory. I think that's what voters are thinking about when they picture a Trump administration, not maybe, June of 2020.
Christina, let me turn to you. How are you making sense of this? How did this type of loss happen for Kamala Harris?
Well, we know that all Democratic voters go to the polls based on economic issues, and oftentimes Democratic presidents have to clean up the messes of Republican presidents who give tax breaks to their friends and destroy the social safety net. And so in a post-Trump, post-COVID presidency, the Biden-Harris administration had a heavy lift. In this particular race for Kamala Harris, a short one at that, she had to make the case, simultaneously running as an incumbent and a newcomer, that the current state of the economy, even though it was getting better, still felt differently than it did under the Trump administration. And obviously, a woman's right to choose and reproductive justice in a financial spectrum mattered a lot to the Democratic Party policy initiatives, thinking about what healthcare would look like for women and families. Those are much larger conversations that the Democratic Party was trying to have with the American public. And clearly, the type of populism that Donald Trump sells, the type of white supremacy that Donald Trump sells, is still very attractive. And so there was a lot of hope that this country had taken a turn, and clearly it hasn't. If you look at the data that's still coming out.
Katie, what did you think after you saw the results? I mean, just 4 years after he attempted to overturn the results of the 2020 presidential election, we see this Trump victory. Were you surprised by it?
I wasn't that surprised. I think that the argument about this being an existential threat and Trump being a fascist was a bit undermined by Democrats' refusal to change tracks on Gaza. The world knew from polling that would have been a popular thing to do. And seeing them refuse to budge at all, seeing Kamala Harris refuse to budge at all from Biden's position, which was very unpopular with the base, while claiming that Trump was this existential fascist threat, I think kind of was less than convincing. But I also think that, as a previous guest said, people vote for bread and butter issues. And I don't think that the Harris campaign really addressed those issues. I don't think that anyone can think of any policies or slogans that she was using or memorable signature issues. And I think that that's really what, in large part, depressed the base.
Ryan, Harris had a different timetable than most nominees. She had basically 3 months to campaign after Biden dropped out of the race or stepped out of the race in July. Did she do enough to distinguish herself?
Clearly not. Democrats chose the one person who had the hardest time distancing herself from the number one because she was the number two. That was a choice. They chose her. Once they chose her, Biden even told her and said publicly, I understand that she's going to be critical at times of what we did, and she's going to present her own path forward. She decided not to do it. One of the things that people were so frustrated about when it came to the 2021 price hikes was the price of Ubers and Lyfts. Yeah. It takes a chunk out of people. The only thing she could do is go after corporate greed. She starts doing that. Then she is told by Tony West, her brother-in-law, not to do that anymore. Tony West is the top lawyer for Uber. It's absurd. Yeah. And that's the Democratic Party. And they set themselves up to fail. I'm even wondering, when Tony West went into the ballot, did he even vote for her?
Oh, wow.
Now, he probably did, because he'd like to see her in the White House, because then he's in the Oval Office all the time. But he was actively sabotaging her campaign, whether he knew it or not. And the problem with Democrats is that they have those people in their inner circle, and they listen to them. The only way that she could argue that she was going to do something different than Biden was that she was going to go after corporate greed and get prices down. She started doing it, and then stopped.
Or Gaza, or, I mean,
she could do that, too.
There are several issues that she could...
Like, what else could I separate myself on? Well, is there anything where his approval rating is like 20? Like, oh, yeah, his handling of Israel-Palestine, Gaza.
Right, I mean, it seemed like an interesting intervention to me. Right. Emma, I got to say, though, I don't know. I would have thought that there would have been more fear about a second Trump presidency that would have translated into more votes for Harris. Not even if people were not enthused about Harris, they may have just said, hey, this Trump thing may not be so good the second time around. I mean, he's openly expressed admiration for dictators. He's espoused violent and authoritarian rhetoric. He said that he would rule like a dictator on day one.
But only on day one.
Only on day one.
Only on day one. I'll be a dictator for one day. I'll violate the principles of American democracy just to start things off, get the ball rolling, then we'll get back to the old thing. Now, you worked under Trump in the first Trump administration. Are you at all concerned about what the second Trump administration might look like?
Well, first of all, I want to respond to part of what you said there.
Please.
I think something I found really interesting was the Washington Post did some polling on undecided voters in spring of this year. And what they found was, when you ask the question, do you care about protecting democracy, a lot of those voters actually broke for Trump. And I think the reason for that is that phrase means different things to different voters. If you're a progressive voter or a Democratic voter, that probably means I'm concerned about Trump changing the structures of the U.S. government or using authoritarian language. But if you're a conservative voter, a libertarian voter, an undecided voter, it might mean I'm concerned about the weaponization of the Department of Justice. I'm concerned about the government, they're receptive to the message that Trump says when he says, they're coming after me because I'm fighting for you. So I think that phrase that we saw in polling of protecting democracy, it cuts different ways for different voters. And if you went into this election assuming that, quote unquote, pro-democracy voters are inherently Harris voters, you're surprised this week to see the outcome. Am I concerned about a second Trump term? I look back at the first term and say I'm not. I think that he uses a lot of language that appeals to people who come out to his rallies. And when he's actually been in government, I've seen it firsthand. He's asked me, can we do this? And I've come back and said that we've looked into it. And the answer is no, that's not legal. And he says, okay, then we're not doing it.
He never says, how can we get around that? How can we finagle this?
Not in my experience.
Wow, I find that hard to believe.
Well, he came into government without a strong, a political history or sense of what government can and can't do. So I do think he asked the question, what can government do, a little more frequently than, President Bush, as somebody who's grown up in a political dynastic family and been around politics their whole life. He genuinely doesn't know. He's not looking for a yes. He wants to know the answer.
He wants to know how government works,
yeah.
Which is just crazy for the president of the United States. But that's another question for another time. Christina, preliminary exit polls show that Trump made inroads among Black and Latino men. A record high number of Latino men voted for Trump, and Trump doubled his share of young Black male voters. The support was particularly significant when you look at battleground states. I mean, it really was a difference maker. How do you make sense of this trend among males of color, and why does it happen?
Right. So when I did focus groups, what I found really interesting was that so many young men, Black men in particular, blamed Kamala Harris for some of the failures of the Barack Obama presidency years. And so he promised them X, Y, and Z. He didn't deliver. And so she wouldn't deliver. So I think that there's some baked in sort of democratic punishment that we saw there. And I mean, let's be clear, there's also some baked in misogyny from men and women across the board. We can't deny that. This is still America and it's only 2024. You know, as far as Latino voters, there are a lot of folks who don't believe his rhetoric as far as deportations and, you know, internment camps. They don't think that they will be affected. They do like the promises of this economic freedom and economic populism that Donald Trump espouses. And so in battleground states where he had taken time, you know, and let's be clear, Black men did not overwhelmingly vote for Donald Trump. He had made some inroads. And to the previous point, you know, when Donald Trump first got elected the first time and he had unified government and didn't know how to use it, we saw him try to use executive orders for a Muslim ban. And he's literally asking questions because he doesn't know. And that is true. But I think that first term, he was casing the joint. The second term, he's got more of the Elon Musks of the world, more billionaire class behind J.D. Vance, who have a specific agenda, and they know that they might have a small time frame the first 2 years before the midterms to actually do some really damaging things, not just about women and reproductive rights, but education, the environment, so many policy issues that Donald Trump didn't really think about the first term that he's had time to think about in ways to punish people in cities in particular who didn't agree with him.
Katie, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the issue of foreign wars, you know, Trump, whether or not it's sincere, he certainly presented himself both times as the anti-war candidate and as someone who's going to drain the swamp. And then he didn't drain the swamp. But I think that people have a lot of fatigue about feeling like their government is spending money and resources to fight in wars abroad that don't protect Americans and that they're not spending money here to protect them. And I think another thing that we have to remember is there's a lot of focus from pundits who are very close to the Democrats on how people switch to Trump. But there's not going to be a lot of reflection on why so many Democrats stayed home. And I think we can understand why. I think neither the Democrats nor their allies in the media want to look at that. They want to blame people for switching to Trump instead of looking at how many of their base stayed home. Because if they looked at that, they'd have to reckon with what they did to not get their base out.
Ryan, what's your take on this?
I got a couple points on this. I'm curious for your guys' take on it. But the non-mainstream media space is now, maybe it's half the country's like media environment. Like Joe Rogan, all of that podcast, YouTube world, Katie, myself. You know, we're reaching maybe half or more of the country at this point. And if you go into any kind of male gendered spaces that otherwise wouldn't be politically coded, sports, video games, like health and wellness stuff, you know, dudes are into that a lot now, bodybuilding, all of the influencers who are doing content around that stuff are now becoming coded Republican and right wing. And are presenting right-wing ideas through their, so they're talking about video games or they're talking about bodybuilding. But if you're doing a 3-hour stream, you're going to talk about the news of the day. And the way that they talk about the news is generally right-wing. Rogan went from kind of a left-wing, center-left guy to like endorsing Trump this year. And you know, people will call him a white supremacist or something. I bet half his audience is non-white. And there's just no left-wing competition. There's no center-left or center-left. There's the Pod Save Bros, but they're
not the same. It was the same issue with right-wing radio.
Audience.
There was like Air America, which was like this much, and then there's like
and then went bankrupt and
and
so I think those things go together. And I think in democratic spaces for like 10 years in the 2010s or so, you really couldn't say anything nice about boys or men without getting asked why you're like entering into problematic territory.
Yeah.
Like men and boys, male became coded as problematic. And young men picked up on that. And they're like, well, fine then.
Emma, does that track with you? Because I've been trying to figure out how certain populations are getting these messages and kind of normalizing them. And what I'm hearing Ryan say is these media spaces, for example, are an opportunity. How are right-wing messages getting to these new demographics?
Yeah, I think Ryan's right. I think the landscape has changed and the way people get their news has changed. And we've known this for a while now, right? That people aren't sitting at home watching the evening news, hearing one perspective and then switching the channel and changing, and no longer taking in news or political content. It's coming in lots of different ways. I think especially with somebody like Donald Trump, who is so ubiquitous in the American cultural landscape and has been for so long. I think that's something we forget a lot in political circles. You go back to the 80s and just what yeah, I mean, he's on every magazine cover. His weddings are covered, his affairs are covered. Like, he's just been around in such a way that he's sort of seeped into the American consciousness in a way that I think, one, would be very hard for any other candidate on the right or the left to imitate or try to capture in the same way. So he's in those spaces because he's in the national conversation in a way that's very different from anybody else. I'm not sure anybody can replicate it. There's only one Trump.
Yeah, that's for sure. Katie, media trust has hit a historic low. 4 out of 10 Americans say they completely lack trust in the media. How do we get there? But more importantly for this conversation, how does Trump benefit from that?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I mean, I think that the media has been very, everyone knows that Fox News has an agenda, right? They don't hide that. But I think now people say the same thing with MSNBC. Now, MSNBC would like to think it's different from Fox. And I think you could argue that there's probably more veracity in some cases on MSNBC, but not in all cases. I think that it's very clear that the media is kind of in bed with the two political parties. And the thing about Trump is that, say what you will about him, one of his constant legs up, I would say, is that there is no expectation of any consistency from him. And that gives him a huge advantage because he can call out people's hypocrisy and it sticks. But no one expects him not to be hypocritical because he never really pretends to be principled in any consistent way, which means that he can't get called out for being a hypocrite because none of his supporters care. And the hypocrisy of Democrats looks hypocritical, whereas the hypocrisy of Donald Trump doesn't really look hypocritical because it's kind of baked into who he is. And so you have him calling out Kamala Harris for courting and running around with Liz Cheney. And even though Donald Trump has said that Israel needs to finish the job, he gets to call out the Cheneys for their legacy in Iraq and being anti-Arab and anti-Muslim. And now another thing about Trump that I think we have to remember is he is both a pathological liar, but he also can be a radical, I don't mean this in a positive way, like a real truth teller, very disruptive. So going back to the issue of Palestine, I remember during his debate with Joe Biden lied and said that only Hamas wanted to keep fighting, Israel wants to stop fighting. And Donald Trump is like, what are you talking about? Of course, Israel wants to keep fighting and they should finish the job, which is this phenomenon I like to call who said it, Trump or Chomsky, which is when Donald Trump says something that Chomsky could have said, like calling out Israel for wanting war, except the takeaway is different. Or the same thing with, of course, we want the oil in Syria, or of course, we're not going to sanction Saudi Arabia over Khashoggi because they just bought a bunch of weapons. So I think people also really resonate with that.
This is another critical, I think, turning point in the election. Let me go to Chrissy first. I want to bring you back in, though, Katie. People were dissatisfied with Joe Biden's response to October 7th. In fact, they were outraged by it. It ranged from dissatisfied to outraged. And when Kamala Harris enters the scene, she had the opportunity to do something different. And it seemed that at every turn, she echoed the language of Biden. How much did the Gaza invasion and the genocide in Gaza affect her? Not just the act itself, but her response to it.
Absolutely. So, one, as someone who has the honor and privilege of teaching young people, I mean, this is something that they care deeply about. And so, unfortunately, that Israel and Palestine are sort of put in the far left corner of Democratic Party policies and what people care about. And so I think the Kamala Harris strategy was to try, if we think about politics as a distribution curve, she and her campaign said, well, let's try and capture all these people in the center. And so as young people and people who care about Gaza, or the Israel-Gaza conversation, and Palestine and Lebanon writ large, are saying, why are we moving to the center to, say, the Liz Cheneys of the world? And are we going to stay there? And so there are sort of two conversations that need to be had. Who do you want to be in opposition with? And so Democrats were saying, well, essentially, if we get in, you'll be in opposition to us, and there'll be some wiggle room and we can have a conversation, because Donald Trump, we know you just need to be the last person in the room to flatter him, and he'll say whatever he needs to say. But by ignoring the base, by catering to certain lobbyists or certain past policies and politics of the Biden-Harris administration, there was a real lost opportunity. And I think as the Democrats spend the next 4 years reevaluating what happened in this particular campaign, we know that if you're trying to get that center of the distribution curve, you cannot ignore the base. And part of the base are people who care deeply about Palestine and Lebanon. There are also people, Black women, who care deeply about being at the table for all these myriad of issues because we're very diverse ideologically. And so this is sort of running a quasi 2016, 2020 campaign in a 2024 space. And to point that was made, a lot of people, echoing Donald Trump, are asking, well, why are we spending money on something that I don't agree with? A lot of tax money, billions upon billions of dollars. And I don't like my public school. I've got potholes in my street. Affordable housing isn't here. And so these are international and domestic conversations.
That's a great point, Ryan. The party has a base that's asking for X, and it seemed that the Democratic response in this cycle was to move to the right of that base and say, what lesson do they learn from that?
And in some aggressive ways. You remember when she went to Michigan and she met with Arab American voters there, and a lot of them told deeply poignant and moving stories about their family members being slaughtered in either Lebanon or in Gaza. And her response was, to this crowd that she had come out to try to woo, was, well, what we all have to remember is that the greatest tragedy was October 7th, and then goes into some fabricated stuff about October 7th and then some real stuff about October 7th, a long talk about October 7th. It's like, okay, everyone gets October 7th bad, but did you have to fly to Michigan and respond to us telling stories of our loved ones being slaughtered by telling us about October 7th, which was now more than a year ago? So they were just quite simply unwilling to do anything.
Emma, do Republicans bank on Democrats making these kinds of preventable errors?
I don't think we did this time around. I think there was a concerted effort to make sure you're reaching as many voters as possible because it was so close. I don't think anybody was sitting around going, well, they're really botching this rollout. I think a lot of people were very nervous when the candidate switch happened, that there was so much initial momentum around Kamala Harris, and a real question of how much do voters care about what she says versus care about having a Democratic president who looks like they can stay awake past 2 p.m. I think there was a real sense of that in the Republican side of the aisle of, okay, Democrats felt they could beat Donald Trump with anybody who wasn't Joe Biden. I don't think we've seen that.
Well, yeah,
I know we haven't.
They're going to have to learn that lesson. Katie, I'll give you the last word here. Do Democrats move forward with any lessons learned? Like, will they next time around, I don't know, listen to their base?
Absolutely not. I mean, that's what's so scary about this. I don't think they will. And you see, Morning Joe and Al Sharpton, their takeaway was that Black men are misogynist and Latino voters are racist. Also, you see a lot of the punditry not distinguishing between Latinos as in the people who are here, who are born here versus people who are undocumented. They're kind of all put in this monolith and no one who knows what they're talking about when it comes to their politics. And the other thing is that you see people on MSNBC saying that the problem was that Kamala Harris was too progressive. And you see people saying that on CNBC. Now, she didn't do anything progressive. I mean, she ran away from her progressive policies from before. But I bring those things up to show that the Democrats and the media elites who protect them and enable them are looking to not have to deal with the mistakes that the Democrats made. And that's, I think, the scariest thing of all, because what the Democrats are doing is just going to keep enabling more Trumpian candidates, and they are not going to learn the lessons. And again, they showed the world that they would rather continue a genocide than defeat someone who they claimed was a fascist.
That'll have to be the last word there. Katie Halper, thank you so much for joining me. Christina Greer, Emma Doyle, Ryan Grimm, thank you all for joining me on UpFront, everybody. That is our show, UpFront. We'll be back next week.